Cambrian Explosion. Words we've all heard, but do we really know what happened? In today's video, I'm going to be talking about what led up to the Cambrian Explosion, what actually happened during the period we call the Cambrian Explosion, and what other things were going on as well. So first things first, the more we learn about this Cambrian Explosion, the more we realize it was actually more like a Precambrian explosion, and the Cambrian part was more of a skeletonization than an explosion of life having not had life before, because there was an explosion of life or radiation of life before the Cambrian. And then at the Cambrian boundary, or even a little before, skeletons and hard parts evolved and radiated. And that's what we initially found in the rock record because hard parts preserve better than soft body organisms. And we called that the Cambrian Explosion. And I'll talk about a little bit more about what we knew when we named it in the next slide, and then what we know now in the slide after. But there was also an extinction during this time, a major extinction, the first major multicellular organism extinction on Earth that we know of, and I'll talk about that as well. And some even argue that there wasn't even an explosion, even before the Cambrian, when the soft-bodied organisms radiated, and that it was more progressive. It's just that due to all the soft bodies and poor preservation, it seems like in the rock record, once more hard parts and larger organisms started to evolve, those preserved better. But let's go through the information that we have, and you can decide for yourself whether it's an explosion or not at the end of the video. So here's what we knew when we made the discovery of the Cambrian explosion at that boundary. We knew that cyanobacterial mats, or what we call stromatolites in the rock record, as shown in the middle picture here, did exist in the Precambrian, and those we expected to see before the Cambrian boundary. However, all sorts of animals first show up at the Cambrian aged rocks is what we thought, and that is when we named it the Cambrian Explosion. And we thought that abundant, large, complex animals couldn't come before that boundary until now. What we know now is, well, we still know that cyanobacterial mats came before, so check that box. And then the GOE, or Great Oxidation Event, occurred around 2.4 to 2.2 billion years ago, causing metabolic diversification and higher energy yields. And I'll talk about that more as we go on, but that's when oxygen levels on Earth rose because of the production of oxygen by these cyanobacteria, because they're photosynthesizers. And so I have a whole video about the GOE. I'll link it up here to the top right, but I'll also go over it more later as well. Then we had the first eukaryotes around 2.7 billion years ago, and I either have a video out now or coming soon about eukaryote evolution if you want to check that out. And then multicellular eukaryotes evolved around 2.1 billion years ago. And then animal-like single-celled organisms are known from around 750 million years ago. And then the first animals, or sponges, are found around 650 million years ago. And then the first animals that were more advanced than sponges and cnidarians are corals and jellies and stuff, and early life was a lot of like jelly-like organisms and soft sponges. But the first animals more advanced than that are around 600 million years ago in the rock record, and their body plan showed that they did preferential motion or movement in one direction, which the primitive sponges and cnidarians don't have, so they were more advanced in that way. And then finally, the Ediacaran fauna, which we can see this leaf-like fossil thing called Dickinsonia to the right, and that is one of the Ediacaran fauna that I'll show today. But these guys likely represent the actual Precambrian explosion of life leading up to the Cambrian. So Ediacaran fauna evolved and kind of started their reign around 570 million years ago. And remember that the Cambrian boundary is around 540 million years ago. So that's about a 30 million year period of the reign of Ediacaran fauna. And they were pretty large, multicellular, soft-bodied invertebrates like jellies, sponges, worms, and soft corals. Many were leaf-like shapes, as we can see this big Dickinsonia on the seafloor here. Then there's like leaf-like organisms or sea pin-like organisms over here. But all of these were not flora. Even though they looked a little bit like leaves, they were below the photic zone where they lived, and they couldn't photosynthesize below the photic zone. So they were clearly fauna. That's why we call it Ediacaran fauna. They lived a sedentary life on the seafloor, and animals that moved around on the seafloor appeared around 560 million years ago. So in geologic time, it seems pretty quick that they went from sedentary to movement, but 10 million years is a long time. However, bilaterally symmetrical organisms were present by 580 million years ago, before the Ediacaran fauna even started their major reign. And so these 580 million year old bilaterally symmetrical organisms, since they were, bilaterally symmetrical, they may have been mobile and represent early mobile animals rather than waiting till 560 million years ago to evolve, movement. In fact, all three major bilaterally symmetrical animal groups had evolved before the Cambrian. The Lophotrochozoans were represented by Cambriella in the Ediacaran fauna, as shown here. The Ecdysozoans, I don't know if I'm saying that right, evolved and were represented by Springina in the Ediacaran. And then deuterostomes, which are the type of bilaterally symmetrical organism that we are, and these were represented by Tribrachidae, and we can see a picture of this over here, the fossil version and the reconstructed version, and this was potentially a deuterostome is what they say. They don't, 100% go out and say it, but all three of these groups likely evolved before the Cambrian even started. But then there was extinction. So there was a two-phase biotic turnover during the EC or Ediacaran Cambrian boundary around 550 to 539 million years ago. I put this little 1 here because I'm getting the information for this slide from a paper that I'll label 1 in the description, so you can check it out for yourself if you want, because not all this information was in my book, so I went to other sources. Anyway, this marked Earth's first major mass extinction event of macroscopic eukaryotic life, in other words, the Ediacaran fauna. And then there was the Cambrian Explosion. So this was the two-phase biotic turnover. And there were two possible causes, abiotic or biotic. If it was abiotically driven, we're talking about major climate catastrophe type things. And if it was biotically or biologically driven, we're talking about replacement and competition type causes. I talk about the abiotic and biological causes of extinction in my extinction video. If you want to check it out, I'll link it up here to the top right. So what evidence do we have for one or the other causes for this mass extinction? Well, there is evidence that anoxia, ocean oxygen depletion, coincided with the Ediacaran extinction. And considering that these organisms lived on the seafloor, they would have been affected by this. However, biologically, there were hard-shelled Cambrian burrowers and grazers that would have disrupted the Ediacaran ecosystem and food chain. And this theory that Cambrian organisms disrupted Ediacaran fauna and kind of led to their decline is backed up by progressively lower species diversity during the later Ediacaran. That suggests a more progressive extinction as opposed to a catastrophic one, as is typically the case for abiotic extinctions. They're a little bit more catastrophic and all at once. So we would think that the progressive nature of this, lower diversity trend would be due to more so biological competition, grazing, burrowing, all that stuff. But some evidence does suggest a time gap in between the extinction of Ediacaran fauna and the explosion or radiation of Cambrian fauna. So that would suggest radiation over replacement, because you can't have biological organisms competing and outcompeting and replacing others if they haven't even evolved yet. And this theory would suggest that the radiation of the animals in the Cambrian was so widespread because these Cambrian animals were able to fill the empty niches that the extinct Ediacaran fauna left behind. So in terms of whether abiotic or biological causes are to blame for this extinction event, we may never know exactly, and the reason is because the fossil record is very incomplete. And it's not just incomplete in one way, it's incomplete in many ways. For example, less than 10% of organisms actually become preserved. And we'll talk in a second why preservation might have been hurt or helped in the Ediacaran time, but in general, not many organisms that were actually present actually become preserved, and this makes the fossil record very incomplete, and we have to kind of account for that in our calculations. And then preservation is also rarely perfect. The imprints you've seen me show in the previous slides are a perfect scenario where an organism that's soft-bodied is able to leave a print that doesn't get erased and that remains in the rock record. And that takes very precise conditions. Most conditions aren't that. Humans also haven't found everything. We're still looking, and we still may find a lot that might give us a lot of answers. And the rock record is constantly being recycled at subduction zones. And this erases our rock record that we have available for us to look in for these fossils. And not only is it that these rocks can be destroyed, but they may also be buried very deeply below more modern rocks and sediment. Because remember, we're talking about over 500 million years ago, when during that 500 million years, there's been lots of deposition, and that covers all the rocks that we want to look at with more rocks. So this extinction event actually marks the greatest change in the complexity of both organisms and ecosystems throughout Earth's history. And like I mentioned earlier, the latest Ediacaran organisms actually represent the earliest phase of the Cambrian Explosion. So it's not really the Cambrian Explosion, because even after the extinction of Ediacaran fauna that are characteristic of Ediacaran fauna, the earliest Cambrian-like organisms are found in the pre-Cambrian, before the Cambrian boundary. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Ediacaran fauna and then the Cambrian fauna just after it, and how they compare and contrast. There were burrowing animals from even over 600 million years ago, so even before the Ediacaran fauna, but Neoproterozoic or Precambrian burrows were very simple and horizontal at shallow depths in the sediment, and Cambrian burrows, on the other hand, become a lot more complex and branching. This represented more advanced feeding behavior evolving in the Cambrian, and Cambrian burrowers could also burrow deeper because of the way they could transport oxygenated water through the sediment, whereas Precambrian burrowers lacked the ability to line their burrows with water, and because oxygen doesn't go that deep in the sediment due to the way bacteria use it up, they wouldn't have been able to go that deep because they needed oxygen to live, so they needed to stay shallow where the oxygen was. As we'll see in a second, cyanobacterial and algal mats eventually lowered in diversity, allowing diversification of Cambrian and future animals. However, during the Ediacaran, these mats may have actually been beneficial, at least for our sake, in terms of preservation of these animals. Because algal mats grew over and protected Ediacaran fauna that had died on the seafloor, they were allowed to be preserved because they weren't being attacked by anything or disturbed by anything. So these algal mats actually provided pretty good protection for the preservation of Ediacaran fauna. However, like I mentioned, in the Cambrian, these mats majorly declined because of grazers. These grazers weren't all bad, though. They were bad to the stromatolites, but they cleared new seafloor for other animals to diversify. So they helped along the diversification of animals in the Cambrian. However, one more thing that might have helped Ediacaran fauna be protected and preserved more often than later fauna is the lack of advanced predators. There were advanced predators that evolved in the Cambrian, but before that, there were not very advanced predators, so that helped the lack of disturbance of the animals after death. However, one of the most important things for preservation is hard parts, which the Ediacaran fauna lacked. So the fact that we have an Ediacaran record at all might be solely due to the fact that we had algal mats and a lack of predators. However, did hard parts wait to the Cambrian to evolve? No, turns out they didn't. A few animals actually had hard parts before the Ediacaran-Cambrian transition. Sponges, for example, had spicules by 650 million years ago. And if you don't know, spicules are just kind of how they build their skeletons or hard parts. And I talk about sponge spicules and sponges in general in my porifera or sponge phylum video, and I'll link it up to the top right if you want to check it out. And Cloudina, another type of animal in the Ediacaran around 550 million years ago, also had hard parts. They were kind of like stacked cups, almost resembling potentially rugose corals later on, or maybe type of bryozoan, I don't know, but they had hard parts. They did end up going extinct at the Ediacaran extinction, but they had hard parts before the Cambrian. However, hard parts weren't abundant and didn't diversify in the animal kingdom until the Cambrian. So it did mark a pretty significant transition into more skeletonized and shelled animals. So let's talk about what did happen at the Cambrian boundary in what we call the Cambrian Explosion. So the new Cambrian phyla, animal phyla, which is just a taxonomic group of organisms. So the major groups of animals that evolved in the Cambrian include arthropoda, arthropods like trilobites and crustaceans, as we can see these trilobites over here to the right, had evolved in the Cambrian. Brachiopods, as we can see in the bottom right of the screen, that look superficially like mollusks but aren't mollusks, had evolved. Chordata, vertebrates, so we're chordates, we're vertebrates, like fishes, had evolved, but their fossils are more patchy and just portions or fragments than rather full fossils, or at least to what I know based on the references I saw. We might have found a more full fish fossil since the things that I looked at have been published, so I don't know, let me know in the comments. Ctenophora or stenophora, I'm not sure, but comb jellies evolved in the Cambrian. Echinoderms evolved in the Cambrian, like crinoid sea urchins and starfish. We can see crinoid fossil to the bottom right as well. Nematodes or roundworms evolved, and then missing phyla that aren't listed here, like porifera or sponges, cnidaria or sea jellies and corals, and annelids and mollusks were all present in the Cambrian, but had already evolved in the Precambrian, so they're not listed in the ones that came about in the Cambrian period. And I put potentially for annelids and mollusks because the references I saw showed that we're certain that porifera and cnidaria were, around in the Ediacaran or the Precambrian, but we're not so certain about the annelids and mollusks, but we have relatively certain evidence for them being around in the Precambrian. A couple major differences between Cambrian fauna and Ediacaran fauna include that the Cambrian fauna was much larger, and most of them belong to phyla that still live today. So a lot of the Ediacaran fauna were kind of similar, but not exactly fitting in phyla that live today. And so it's almost like it was an evolutionary experiment, that failed, an extinction event that then led to the actual phyla that we have today that didn't fail, in their experiment, and they continue to diversify, radiate, and end up being what lives today. So in the next few slides, I'll talk about a few major Cambrian organisms that were really cool, and then I'll go on to why the Cambrian explosion and why it waited so long to happen. So in terms of Cambrian organisms, there were major predators, huge carnivorous predators called anomalocarids that we can see the diversity of in the bottom right figure. And these were arthropods that had large eyes on stalks that helped them hunt prey. And they propelled themselves with flaps along their segmented body. And they got up to 2 meters or 6 feet long. There were also archaeocyathids, which were the major reef builders in the early Cambrian. And we don't know what phylum these guys fit in. They're kind of like many of the Ediacaran fauna in that way. They're kind of mysterious in what they fit in. We've placed them potentially in sponges, but they might also be a sponge-like evolutionary experiment, and they ended up, failing because then they underwent an enigmatic extinction at the end of the early Cambrian. And it's enigmatic because we really don't know why they went extinct. They were super widespread, and then boom, extinction, and we don't know why. I talk about that more in my sponge video as well, but yeah, it's a mystery. And another mystery that goes along with it are the corals that helped them build their reefs at the time. These were potentially tabulate corals, but again, we're not sure whether they just resembled tabulates or they were, because they actually underwent the same extinction as the archaeocyathids. At least that's how it appears in the rock record. So they basically left no fossil record after the mid-Cambrian extinction event until the Ordovician, or tabulates, did in any case. And so we don't know whether they were tabulates and they just managed to leave no trace of themselves for, the time between the mid-Cambrian and Ordovician, or whether they were a separate kind of evolutionary experiment similar to tabulate corals that did end up going extinct at the mid-Cambrian, and then tabulates evolved during the Ordovician. But in any case, these were the major animals and animal events that I think are worth mentioning for the early to mid-Cambrian, and now we'll move on to why the Cambrian explosion happened. So the Cambrian again marked a drastic increase in skeleton and shell secreting organisms and a diversification and complexation of animals. But why now? What factors led to this increase in diversification and complexation? Well, if we look at the timing of oxidation events, so I talked about the Great Oxidation around 2.4 to 2.2 billion years ago. However, there was another oxidation event in the Neoproterozoic right before, the Ediacaran and Cambrian fauna evolved. And the timing suggests that oxygen relates heavily to the evolution of eukaryotes when the first eukaryotes appeared in the rock record, and to the Ediacaran and Cambrian radiations, which heavily correlate with the Neoproterozoic oxidation event timing. But other than oxygen, why was there such low diversity before the Neoproterozoic and Cambrian times? And why was there high diversity during and after those times? So to answer the first question of why there was low diversity leading up to the Neoproterozoic for like a billion years, well, we can answer that in a few different ways. One, we can answer why there was apparent low diversity with a lack of hard parts, so poor preservation, and also a lack of rock record and really old rocks. But in terms of the lack of actual diversity, rather than just the apparent lack of diversity, there was a lack of oxygen in the deep ocean and a lack of habitable environments because of that. Because these organisms like to live on the seafloor, if there wasn't enough oxygen to promote their complex and large multicellular, multifunction lifestyle, then they would have had a hard time living and diversifying, and especially becoming larger and more complex, because oxygen allows higher energy yields with metabolism. What we all do to gain energy, we respire oxygen, and because we do so, we make enough ATP to support our large and extravagant lifestyle that we live as multicellular animals. There was also major snowball Earth events during and after these major oxidation events of Earth's history. So these would have caused major declines in biodiversity and habitable environments because of just the environment that it would have caused to be in a snowball Earth. I mean, it's pretty miraculous that biology was able to survive those things anyway. And then, like I mentioned, oxygen didn't just limit habitable environments by not being in the deep ocean, but also limited energy yields for animals to be large and complex. I mean, probably the largest and complexest organism type in the PREcambrian were stromatolites, and these were not one organism. These were many communities of organisms. So they had to work together at that point. And now to answer the question of why high diversity happened after or during and after the Neoproterozoic. Well, hard parts evolved for one, and that increased preservation, which led to a more apparent higher diversity of organisms during that time. And also there's more complete rock record because it's younger rocks. So again, more apparent diversity. But in terms of actual diversity, there was a buildup of oxygen in the ocean at the time because the atmosphere was largely oxygenated to a certain level by the first oxidation event, but the ocean, especially bottom waters in the ocean, took a while and were more up and down before they became stably oxygenated later after the Neoproterozoic oxidation event, at least from what we can tell. And that caused an increase in habitable seafloor. And the end of the snowball Earth were caused by warming that allowed transgression of shallow seas onto continental masses at the time, which led to more habitable environments because shallow seas are great for diversifying life, especially when they just form and they're brand new and they get to just move in and diversify like crazy. And then also due to more oxygen was increased metabolic energy yields. Like I mentioned, more oxygen leads to higher complexity because these organisms are allowed to do a metabolism called oxygen respiration, like we do, that gives them more ATP and more energy to use for multicellular life and multifunctional lives. And that's why they started growing skeletons, and they could grow skeletons because they had the energy to carry out such an energetically expensive process. Tectonics also contributed to the skeleton and shell building during the time because this increased nutrient flux to the ocean, leading to more calcium and phosphorus to the ocean, which led to, at first, calcium phosphate skeletons, and later, with oxygen increase and allowing organisms to use more energy to secrete calcium carbonate, came calcium carbonate or calcitic and aragonitic skeletons, which is very common nowadays. And then the last thing that really did help skeleton evolution to happen, because it made it really advantageous for those animals in the Cambrian, is predator evolution. Because large and carnivorous predators had evolved, it was really beneficial for these animals that were living sedentary or even moving lifestyles on the seafloor to evolve skeletons. So not only was it allowed now by oxygen increase and nutrient flux, but it was also, once they started doing it, really advantageous, which led to more of it because natural selection. And then the last thing that also increased diversity during and after the Neoproterozoic and Cambrian was mat grazing. Because grazers evolved during this time, they cleared the seafloor of all the cyanobacterial and algal mats that were covering the seafloor before, and this led to a diversification of other organisms. This allowed other organisms like animals to diversify on that seafloor that they cleared. However, it did do a number on the poor stromatolites. So what caused oxygen to increase during the Neoproterozoic? Well, there was enhanced nutrient supply, like I mentioned, and that caused enhanced primary productivity, which enhances carbon burial. And so an enhanced carbon burial always increases oxygen to the atmosphere, or sources oxygen to the atmosphere, because that oxygen is not being used to oxidize that carbon. And then there were also ecosystem engineering species like sponges that helped to increase oxygen in the ocean at the time, and a greening of the land surface, which greening as in photosynthesizing organisms, which led to more oxygen because they produce oxygen. And the rock record indicates that by the late Neoproterozoic, the atmosphere had been well oxygenated, but there was a slight delay in ocean oxygenation until the Cambrian, which could have led to the slight delay in complexation and skeletonization of animals until the Cambrian period. And I talk about all of these three oxygen increase causes for the Neoproterozoic, as well as this delay of oxygen versus atmosphere oxygenation, in my Neoproterozoic oxidation event video. And I'll link that up here to the top right if you want to check it out. And to summarize everything we talked about today, animals diversified 30 million years before the Cambrian period began. So around 570 million years ago is when the Ediacaran fauna started to radiate and diversify. And they did so for a while before they underwent an extinction event, before the Cambrian animals diversified and radiated in the Cambrian, with what was less of an explosion and more so a skeletonization in the Cambrian, but that's kind of a long, term or phrase. So it's probably best that maybe we stick with Cambrian explosion, even though it's not that accurate. And then oxygen likely played a major role in both evolution of eukaryotes in the first oxidation event and the expansion and diversification and complexation of eukaryotes in the Neoproterozoic and Cambrian periods. So if you want to check out the major reference I'm using to make this and other videos in the historical geology playlist, it's linked in my description below, called Earth System History. And I'm also using for this video the geomicrobiology book I link for my geobiology playlist, because it also talks about eukaryote evolution and a little bit about the oxygenation events that helped along animal diversification during this time. And yes, I am using both post-it notes and napkins as bookmarks. And then also also, if you want to check out related videos, I have here the Neoproterozoic oxidation event video and my eukaryote evolution video, which if it's out, but if it's not out, I'll try and come back and put it in later. And then also you can check out the historical geology playlist, which will pop up here in any second as well. And with that, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.